These are my 7 cardinal lifestyle rules for aging. Things that I think everyone should implement, at least to a certain degree. Maybe not all the time, but implement these things into your life. And even if you don't implement all 7 of them, maybe you implement 5 of them. Maybe there's one that just really doesn't align with your values, and that's totally okay. Okay. Now, the reason that I chose these 7 is because of the cascading effects each one has into different categories. Like, we know rest and recovery is important. We know exercise is important. We know nutrition is important. We know that sleep's important. Okay, but that would be a pretty ambiguous video to just say, these are my things that I think are important for lifestyle, and just talk about very vague, ambiguous things. I want to give you pragmatic things. So the 7 cardinal rules that I follow are pretty particular. Okay. Now, again, full disclaimer, this does not mean that this is going to improve your longevity. I am not a doctor. This is anecdotal, and this is what I do. Okay. So let's go ahead and break it down. Sleep is imperative. It's undeniable. We need sleep. Today's video is sponsored by Helix, which is the mattress that I use. My wife and I love it. It's so easy to get. Like, you go online, you take this little quiz that'll help you determine the best kind of mattress for you. But the cool thing is with Helix, my wife takes the quiz, I took the quiz, right? And then at the end of that, it breaks down, here's the best kind of mattress that's for both of you. So you can both agree on. So I'm not asking for the firmer mattress while my wife Amber is asking for the softer mattress. We find that middle ground. So there is a link down below where you can save up to $200 off of a Helix mattress, plus get 2 pillows. Okay, so really cool deal, but also you will find that there is a 100-night sleep test guarantee. So if you don't like it after 100 nights, call them up, they'll take it back, no questions asked, super easy peasy. But I'm telling you, like, it's the first mattress my wife and I have ever agreed on. It makes it so that when we go out of town and we even stay at like a nice hotel, we're literally missing our Helix mattress at home. It is a game changer for your sleep, game changer for like tossing and turning. Like if Amber's moving around or she's not feeling good, finally it's not keeping me up. So my experience has been awesome. Then it gets delivered to your doorstep, super easy. You don't have to like be holding on with your hand over the roof of your car in a Honda Civic. You don't have to do that. It just gets delivered right to your doorstep. So check them out and save up to $200 down below in the description and get those 2 free pillows too. The first thing seems kind of vague and seems kind of simple, but it is to consume a high fiber diet. Now, there's some inconclusive research that's out there surrounding this, and there's some pretty concrete stuff. But one of the things that I am a fan of is eating a diverse plethora of foods. I feel like it's very important overall, and now the research is starting to show it. There was a new study that was published in the journal Gerontology that took a look at just this. They found that it didn't really matter how much carbohydrates people ate. In fact, if people ate high glycemic carbohydrates, or if they eat a lot of carbohydrates, or their glycemic load was high, that didn't seem to be a factor when it came down to what they called successful aging. It really didn't. But what did seem to be a factor was fiber intake. Fiber intake seemed to be a stronger player for quote unquote successful aging. That does not mean that you go out and you eat 800 grams of carbohydrates, not at all. But what it does imply is that 200 grams of carbohydrates, that's maybe super high glycemic, compared to 200 grams of carbohydrates that has 50 grams of fiber with it, that's a different ball game altogether, right? The fiber and the gut diversity might be playing a role. Now, here's something that's kind of interesting. When you start looking at the blue zones, like things like Costa Rica, the Mediterranean, stuff like that, they eat a fair bit of carbohydrates. But what's interesting is they eat a lot of fiber too. And with fiber, what happens is it creates more of these short chain fatty acids. When fiber gets acted upon by bacteria, it feeds on it and it ferments and creates short chain fatty acids. What happens down the line from that is you have increases in what's called PYY. There's various increases in various things, but also glucagon-like peptide 1, which are pretty strongly correlated with appetite suppression. Okay, so I think one of the biggest factors with fiber potentially being associated with longevity is the fact that fiber satiates us and triggers these satiation responses, which therefore allow us to eat less. And when you look at like the Okinawans, when you look at these blue zones, a lot of them are in a caloric deficit, which can be good for what is called the NAD to NADH ratio, which leads me right into the next one, which is another cardinal rule, which is practicing a cyclical ketogenic diet. Okay. People bag on me because I don't stay keto all the time. I do keto for a few months and then I take a few weeks off. Keto for a few months, take a few weeks off. I do that for a reason. But let's start with how keto is powerful when it comes down to potential longevity effects. The effect of ketones on cells is pretty interesting. Ketones can increase what is called FOXO3. FOXO3 regulates the expression of endogenous antioxidants. So these endogenous antioxidants play a role in aging. They play a role in longevity. They play a role in what is called sirtuin activation. And sirtuins are a big piece of aging. If you look at Dr. David Sinclair's research, that is pretty much all he's looking at, is like resveratrol and sirtuins and all of this. Now, to give you some more context, here's kind of what happens. There's this thing called the NAD to NADH ratio that I mentioned before. So NAD, for lack of a better way of saying it, it is required for just about everything in our body. If we did not have NAD, we would be dead within 15 to 30 seconds, okay? So what happens is NAD carries electrons into a cell to ultimately be used. Oversimplifying here, just to make it simple. But what happens is NAD binds to something called NADH. When it binds to NADH, the NAD is used up, okay? So every time we eat a bunch of carbohydrates, NAD binds to NADH and travels into a cell. Again, oversimplification. When we are on keto or when we are fasting, well, energy from the food that does not contain glucose, energy from fats and ketones, that does not require the NAD to bind to the NADH. So what does all that gobbledygook mean? It simply means that you have more NAD available. Okay, less NAD is being used up in energy metabolism, thereby allowing more NAD to be available for something very important, sirtuin activation. Sirtuins can trigger a cascade of longevity effects, and that's where the research in sirtuins is really fascinating. But they have to get acted upon. Okay, these sirtuins get activated by NAD. But if all of your NAD is being taken up by glucose metabolism, do the math. Sirtuins aren't activated. So with keto, we allow for more potential sirtuin activation. But I don't like to do keto all the time. Not because I don't love it, I love how I feel with it, but there's evidence that shows that when you are keto for a long period of time, you increase reactive oxygen species in and of itself because fat oxidation creates ROS, creates reactive stress, reactive oxygen species and oxidative stress. The only way that you can ever get your body to play catch up and deal with that is to occasionally come off of keto. That reactive oxygen species increase that comes as a result of ketosis and burning fat is a good thing because it's triggering our body to adapt. Just like when you go for a run, you create reactive oxygen species and that signals your body to adapt so that you can handle the run. But if you run 100 days in a row, you're gonna be overwhelmed, right? And your body's gonna have too much damage and it's gonna be hard to build it back. So taking periodic breaks off of keto can be really good. The other reason that it's very important is for mTOR stimulation, which we'll talk about in a second. It's actually another cardinal rule. So we'll get to that in a second. If you are not into keto, that is totally okay, I get it. A lot of the research is pretty powerful there. I will say one study before I get into an alternative. Journal Cell Metabolism did a rodent study where they looked at mice, and after 12 months of just being mature, so a 12-month-old mice, they put them into either a ketogenic nutrition group, so where they ate a ketogenic diet, or a control group, and then they let them live out their lives. The ketogenic group outlived the control group, and they had preserved their physiological function. More muscle, everything was functioning better for a longer period of time. That's a rodent model, so we can't apply it directly to humans, but there's a lot of evidence with keto being very powerful. Now, if you're not into that, something you can do is intermittent fasting, which I talk about a lot too. So if you prefer to keep the carbohydrates in the mix, that's fine, okay? In that case, you may want to implement like 18-hour fasts 3 or 4 days a week, or you may want to do like a longer fast, like a 24 or a 48-hour fast or something like that periodically. So you can still get some ketone formation and get some effect there. But we also, one of the biggest things we're trying to pay attention to is insulin modulation. We don't want a bunch of insulin resistance. Let me explain something. There was a study that was published in Diabetes Care. Very interesting. Took a look at non-diabetic people that were of normal weight, normal BMI. Okay, they found that insulin resistance was a predictive indicator of mortality. So the higher the level of insulin resistance, the more likely they were to die. And the contrary, the lower the level of insulin resistance, the less likely they were to die. What this is demonstrating is that not carbohydrates being bad, but that the overconsumption of carbohydrates and the constant stimulation of our cells being bombarded with glucose is a problem when it comes to mortality, when it comes down to potential longevity. So what we don't want to be sitting in is a situation where we're just constantly bombarding ourselves with food, spiking insulin, making ourselves insulin resistant. Yes, a ketogenic diet can be great because you're not making yourself as insulin resistant, right? But at least by fasting, you're giving your body a dang break from the carbohydrates and the insulin for a minute. So if you don't want to do keto, at least do fasting. Or if you really want to level it up, you do the keto plus fasting. But it all kind of encompasses as one cardinal rule. When you are eating the carbs, apply cardinal rule 1, which is having the fiber in the mix. The next cardinal rule that I have is make sure that you are stimulating mTOR, which kind of makes no sense at first. If you are familiar with anti-aging content and the anti-aging research, in fact, you'll probably try to debunk this and say, well, mTOR is bad because mTOR is anabolic and mTOR is pro-growth. And in fact, when you look at that cell metabolism study that looked at the mice that did keto, the researchers even hypothesized that it was the suppression of mTOR that allowed the mice to live longer. But there is a difference between mTOR-C and mTOR-ULK1 pathway and all these different kinds of mTOR. Making sure that you are still keeping your body in a growth mode as far as muscle and as far as being alive is concerned is very important. mTOR is also responsible for storing memories, okay? So quality of life, mTOR matters. So how do you spike mTOR? Because mTOR is normally spiked along with insulin, right? When you have an insulin spike, mTOR elevates and you build muscle, it's anabolic. Well, mTOR also spikes when you work out, when you move your muscles, when you move your body. mTOR is not just associated with what you eat. You can have mTOR signaling by movement, but it's very important because that mTOR is, I think, a valuable signal for life. Because if you were to just fast and not have any mTOR, you could live for a while, sure, right? But if you were sitting on your bum doing nothing, your body's just going to atrophy, going to break down muscle tissue. Muscle tissue is metabolic. Then it's going to start breaking down everything else. It's going to break down, who knows, organ tissue, whatever. The body needs that muscle, it needs that stimulation. So a cardinal rule for me is to make sure that I'm still having periodic stimulation of mTOR. Whether that means periodic carbohydrates to cause a little spike, or whether that means working out, lifting weights, that is so important. It's so important. And you can do more research into it, but don't be afraid of mTOR. That is like a longevity myth that I think needs to be dispelled. mTOR is not the enemy, but we don't want this constant stimulation of it. The next lifestyle cardinal rule is getting lots of sunlight. We can get vitamin D from food. Sure, we can eat pasture-raised eggs. We can eat fish. We can get it from the diet. We definitely can. But if you ask me, nothing is better than real sunlight. And I think we're seeing a lot of people moving that direction. Vitamin D3 is so critical for so many different functions in our body. It is not a vitamin, it is a hormone. And this hormone has so many different properties, ranging from mood, ranging from metabolism, ranging to muscle building, ranging to possibly even weight loss. There is a lot going on. And the more weight that we gain, the more fat that we have, the more vitamin D3 gets sequestered into our fat cells, which is a perfect indicator of the more unhealthy you get, the less vitamin D you have available. It's like, it kind of tells you right then and there, it's almost the opposite of health to have low vitamin D. It's like a very good barometer, if you ask me. And again, this is my own anecdotal experience, so take whatever you want. But I look at research all day, every day. It's what I do. And vitamin D3 is very fascinating. But I don't want to just sit there and eat fatty fish all the time. I get tired of mackerel. And I think that the reality is we need to be outside more. So when we look at longevity, that is such a big pivotal piece because it cascades into how we sleep. It cascades into other hormones, vitamin A and things like that we need to pay attention to. Putting that one aside, the next cardinal rule is to eat within 12-hour blocks no matter what your diet is. So remember how I said you may not want to implement everything I talk about here? That's fine, you don't have to. But there's certain things, and I think no matter what you're eating, the 12-hour block rule is so important. And it's simple, it's the insulin resistance piece. Remember that study that I mentioned from Diabetes Care that mentioned that insulin resistance is correlated more so with mortality than not? So what I look at here is giving your body a break from food. but also how it cascades into sleep. Okay, within this, if I stop eating at 6 p.m., that means if I go to bed at 9 p.m., I have 3 hours before I go to bed. And that 3-hour period of being able to digest and break down that food allows me to not have weird blood sugar spikes throughout the night, which allows me to get into that REM sleep that I need, that deep phase sleep, that slow wave sleep that I want, that is truly considered to be restorative. And I get that sleep efficiency that I want. So that really does cascade there too. So it's not just about the insulin resistance, it's about how it makes you sleep, which is why I consider it a cardinal rule. Okay, does that mean that occasionally I don't have a later dinner or occasionally I don't have dessert? Of course I still do that from time to time, but a cardinal rule means this is something that is part of my life and is my lifestyle. The next one is having space between my meals. I always try to make sure that I am having adequate time in between meals. 3 or 4 hours, generally speaking. I have a bigger breakfast, a smaller lunch, and an even smaller dinner. And if I do have a snack, it's at a very distinct time. I'm not saying you need to be crazy regimented about everything, but it all comes down to the insulin sensitivity piece again. Remember, that was a big piece here. Okay? And being able to allow our body to remain insulin sensitive can help us get more out of our ketogenic protocols, more out of our intermittent fasting, and more out of our life altogether. So that is a very, very important piece that I pay attention to there. Now, ordinarily, I would say number 7 is fasting, doing a longer fast. And we can add it as an 8th one if you really wanted to, but I kind of mentioned it in the first cardinal rule because it all kind of was encompassed in the whole ketone discussion. I do think that having like a 48-hour fast once a month is a pretty good practice to get in the habit of if you're adjusted to it. But I want to focus on something that I think is exceptionally important too, and that's that zone 2 cardio. Okay, when it comes to aging, when it comes to longevity, I think zone 2 cardio is really where it's at. Okay, just like I mentioned with the keto piece, if you exercise and you do cardio, it creates just enough reactive oxygen species to trigger a mitochondrial adaptation. That mitochondrial adaptation means that you're developing more what is called mitochondrial mass, more ability to oxidize fuel at a faster rate. The more that you can oxidize fuel and not have a buildup, the more, once again, NAD you will have available because you're not having sort of a backlog. You're having more mitochondria available to process that fuel, and that's going to do just that. But also being fat adapted comes with its own set of benefits. For example, histone deacetylase inhibition that comes with ketone values being higher, meaning you can express more genes that might play a role in overall longevity. Okay? So these things are very, very important to look at overall. And in case you're wondering what zone 2 cardio is, zone 2 cardio is the typical kind of fat loss heart rate zone, right? Like, so you're kind of sitting in a relatively moderate cardio zone. If you go too low in the way of the cardio, sure, you get some effects, you get some fat utilization, but you're also not getting the cardiovascular benefit there. Zone 3, and when you start really pushing the intensity, well, that's great too for triggering adaptation for an athlete, and I think that that has a place. When it comes down to longevity, I'm a big fan of getting zone 2 in 3, sometimes even 4, sometimes even 5 days per week. If I had to choose like what kind of cardio that I would do for the rest of my life, it would be something in that zone 2 or zone 2 to low zone 3 category. That way I feel like I'm still getting aerobic benefit, I'm getting fat loss benefit, but I'm also getting the longevity effects that aren't causing so much stress on my body. So with this, I could come up with a lot more nuancy stuff. And to list a couple things, I'm a big fan of a sauna, I'm a big fan of cold plunges, I'm a big fan of meditation. But those aren't things that I necessarily want to say are cardinal rules. They're things that I implement in my life, but when it comes down to lifestyle and things that I can take with me anywhere and everywhere, wherever I'm traveling, where I can't bring my barrel sauna with me, or I can't bring a cold plunge with me, these are the things that I do. So as always, keep it locked in here on my channel, and I'll see you tomorrow.